Welcome to the last of our 6 lectures in the Spring 2024 Faculty Lecture Series. I'm Liz McGowan in the Art Department, and I've been very thrilled to have all of you this semester here in Lawrence 231, downstairs from the Williams College Museum of Art. So today's speaker, Chris Koné, will introduce us to the world building within the designs of homes by the legendary Karl Lagerfeld. But before I introduce him in earnest, let me explain to those who are attending for the first time what the series is all about. This talk is presented as part of the Spring 2024 Faculty Lecture Series, which the series was founded in 1911 by Catherine Mariotti Pratt, the spouse of a faculty member who wanted to, quote, relieve the tedium of long New England winters with an opportunity to hear Williams professors talk about issues that really mattered to them. From these beginnings, the Faculty Lecture Series has grown to actually become an important forum for tenured professors to share their latest research with the larger intellectual community of the college and beyond. After today's talk, there will be a reception upstairs with light snacks in the lobby area of the Williams College Museum of Art. And before I go any further, I'd like to say that it has been a lot of fun working with Anne Jascott on these lectures this term, and we would both like to thank the members of the lecture committee who allowed us to do this. Michael McDonald, Carrie Green, Allison Zhang, Even Boyle, and Julia Karp, the 3 student members of the committee. So let's see. So Christophe Koné is an associate professor of German and the director of the Oakley Center for the Humanities and Social Sciences here at Williams. He holds a master's degree in German studies from the Université Lumière, Lyon 2, France, and a Ph.D. in German studies from Rutgers University in New Jersey. His research interests include German Romanticism, Modernism, film studies, art history, comics, modern dance, and fashion studies. He's published on a wide variety of topics, from the staging of Wagnerian operas to sex dolls, in both German and American publications. He's also the author of a book-length study of what happened to our image of the. He's also the author of a book-length study on the cultural associations of dolls and society.
I don't know how,
in German life, literature, art, and film in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. You can see the cover for this book here. The book, Uncanny Creatures, Doll Thinking in Modern German Culture, will be published by the University of Michigan Press in July. So recently, he's turned his focus to the legendary Karl Lagerfeld, the German-born designer of the couture houses of Chanel and Fendi, who was known not only for his couture and ready-wear designs, but also as a photographer, an illustrator, caricaturist, collector, bookstore owner, and editor. This afternoon, Christophe's talk, The House of Lagerfeld, Fashioning Homes for an Alternative German Homeland, will focus on a number of houses owned by Lagerfeld in order to explore the designer's complex relationship with his country of origin, highlight the omnipresence of his German cultural heritage in his collections, and address his idiosyncratic engagement with time and time periods. But before we welcome Christopher Koné, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a present homeland. We acknowledge with gratitude and humility that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable place for all. Please join me in welcoming Christophe Koné.
thank you, Liz. So thank you so much, Liz, for this very nice introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the lecture committee, Michael McDonald, Anne Jascott, Elizabeth McGowan, Carrie Green, Alison Zhang, Evan Boyd, and Julia Karp for reaching out and inviting me and giving me this opportunity to present brand new research. So I'm pretty excited, and I hope you are. So I actually wanted to thank you all for coming today. I know too well how precious and scarce everyone's time is. I can also imagine how tired everybody must be one day before the break. So thank you again. Your presence means a lot to me, and I just hope that my talk will make it worth your while. And I'm also saying that I'm very interested in feedback. So again, this is kind of a draft of a chapter. This is the start of a new book project, and I welcome criticism, I welcome feedback, I welcome recommendation for readings, and so on. So I have two disclaimers. The first one is I will not talk about dolls. I promise I will at some point later on. But as Gwyneth Paltrow put it very nicely, doll makers and I, we're doing some conscious uncoupling right now. So I decided to take a break. And also, second disclaimer, I would not talk too much about fashion. I will talk a lot about a fashion designer, and I will talk a lot about homes, but I would not talk about fashion. That will happen because I will also devote chapters of my book looking at very particular collection that Lagerfeld did for Chanel, Fendi, or his own label. So that being said, and since you guys are still here, I am gonna get started. And of course, I can see. Yes. Wonderful. All right. So, Karl Lagerfeld, whoops. Yeah, sorry, that's the image. Karl Lagerfeld was a German-born fashion designer, photographer, illustrator, caricaturist, collector, and editor. He designed for the couture houses of Chloe, Chanel, Fendi for his own label, Karl Lagerfeld, and for the fast fashion retailer H&M. For the record, the collaboration, the 2004 collaboration on a capsule collection between the Swedish low-end clothing company H&M and the high-end fashion designer Karl Lagerfeld propelled him to worldwide fame and stardom. And before I continue, let's hear how he feels about his celebrity status.
Karl, of course, you spend a lot of time in Rome and also in Paris.
I go between the two cities because I have a plane. So
but you grew
I may
up,
be commercial, but I don't fly commercial. No, but I cannot, because people bother me to a degree you don't have an idea. Oh,
really? What
they want
happens?
selfies, things like that. But it's my fault. I'm too easy to recognize.
Does it bother you, though? You don't want to be?
Bother,
or is
no,
it-
but
yeah.
there's a moment you're tired of it. Huh? Especially if you have to go to those gates, even if you throw your jacket and then they take the photos and things like that. No. That's in my contract. Huh?
Can you go anywhere, Karl, do you think, without being recognized?
No, I go nowhere. Nearly never.
But does that upset you that you can't go anywhere?
No, I always have bodyguards and things, but it's ridiculous. But you know,
Yeah.
You cannot have the butter and the money of the butter.
Karl, can
Whoops.
I time in Rome and can you go?
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I will stop here by the phrase, you can have the butter and the money of the butter, which is a French idiom. So I think this is also very funny. You can have the cake and eat it. That's what he wants to say. Indeed, the three Karl Lagerfeld, sorry, my slides are out of order. Yes. So, indeed, the three Karl Lagerfeld estate sales at Sotheby's, taking place in Monaco and Paris in 2021 and Cologne in 2022, which made a total of 22.5 million, attest to Lagerfeld's status as a pop icon. Collectors did bid on precious and rare antiques and artifacts from Lagerfeld's collection, but the bidding war was in fact on memorabilia worn by the designer himself. For example, Lagerfeld's personal Chanel tote bag went for a hammer price of $107,000, making it the most expensive Chanel bag ever sold at an auction. Strangely enough, the German identity of Karl Lagerfeld, despite his nickname, the Kaiser, his pronounced German accent, as you heard, his Prussian discipline and work ethics. The man was designing up to 12 collections a year for Chanel, Fendi, and his eponymous label, has been gradually erased in the course of his career, and particularly from 2004 on, when he became a global phenomenon. The surprise I often witness when I remind people that Lagerfeld was born and raised in Hamburg, and that he remained a German citizen throughout his life, sparked my interest in his Germanness. I am completely German, he confessed to his old friend Alfons Kaiser, the fashion editorialist of the FAZ newspaper, and I couldn't agree more. Truth to be told, the erasure of his Germanness was not an accident. It was a deliberate effort on Lagerfeld's end when he moved to Paris in 1952 at the age of 19, after winning a fashion contest, to distract from his German origin, and he invented stories to avoid questions about his family. Thus, he claimed back then that his father, Otto Lagerfeld, an industrialist who collaborated with the Nazis and supplied the Wehrmacht army with condensed milk during World War II, was a Swedish aristocrat. For the record, in post-war France, the resentment against German was pretty palpable, as the trauma of German occupation and French collaboration was still raw until the 70s. For instance, in 1971, French fashion designer Yves Saint Laurent, who set up a spring-summer couture collection entitled Libération, inspired by 1940s French fashion under Nazi occupation, sparked an outrage. Saint Laurent was attacked by the French press, which called his collection, quote, the most hideous of the century. Under these circumstances, one understands why Lagerfeld kept his Germanness under the radar and rapidly assimilated into French culture and Parisian society. When in 1983, Lagerfeld, that is a German-born designer, took the reins of Chanel, back then an old-fashioned couture house on the decline, the news in France was greeted with stupefaction. For the specter of German occupation and French collaboration once again resurfaced. In 1941, Coco Chanel started an affair with Hans Günther von Dinklage, Nazi officer and Gestapo spy, with whom she fled France after World War II and moved to Switzerland until 1954, when she reopened her couture house and made a comeback in Paris. While Lagerfeld had to downplay his German cultural heritage from roughly the 50s to the 80s, at the start of the 90s, he began to overtly display his Germanness. A quick look at the Chanel collection from the 80s reveals subtle and sporadic nods to German culture, but from the 90s on, Lagerfeld embraces roots and German cultural heritage. Proofs are the choice of German top models Claudia Schiffer and Nadia Auermann as the designer's muses, the Chanel fashion shows inspired by the Brothers Grimm fairy tale, so the collection was called A Visit to the Enchanted Forest, or even their location. So there was Paris, Salzburg, the Chanel Métiers d'Art Haute Couture collection in 2014. You see here the advertising campaign. And there was also a Paris Hamburg Chanel et Métiers d'Art, which took place in Hamburg, which was also celebrated as Lagerfeld's return to Hamburg in 2018. I just want to add just a side note that he died in 2019. So I don't think it's random that a year before he died, he decided to go back to Hamburg. Much has been said on and by Karl Lagerfeld himself during his lifetime. Even more has been written since his passing in 2019. Serious biographies by respected journalists have come out, such as Kaiser Karl, The Life of Karl Lagerfeld by Raphael Baquet, who's a very respected politician, journalist. Karl Lagerfeld, A Life in Fashion by Alfons Kaiser, who actually was a close friend of Karl Lagerfeld. And Paradise Now, The Extraordinary Life of Karl Lagerfeld by William Middleton, who's a fashion journalist, who also knew Lagerfeld really well. And the latest one, Karl Lagerfeld, A Life in Houses by Patrick Moriès and Mary Colt. While all these recent books attest to the fascination Kaiser Karl still holds a few years after his death, they certainly reinforce Lagerfeld's legendary and extraordinary dimension by making him a true fictional character of a Bildungsroman whose story he spent his whole life retelling. And just a side note, there's a lot of similarities between Coco Chanel and Karl Lagerfeld, who kept reinventing their biographies. All the attempts at lifting off the veil from that enigmatic figure is inevitably failed. For it is an impossible task to unmask a puppet, as Lagerfeld liked to call himself, referring to the public persona and the pop celebrity he had morphed into. I propose something different. I offer to take his Germanness as a point of departure. I posit that investigating his complex relationship with his country of origin and family history, examining his great knowledge of German culture, his selective memory of German history, as well as his interest in contemporary German politics, may give a deeper insight into this German immigrant. I also offer to seriously consider him as a collector. For a fashion designer is, by definition, a collector, in the sense that they periodically assemble together pieces of clothes and accessories around a theme or an idea. Thus, it is not a coincidence that fashion has entered museum collections since the 80s. Lagerfeld did spend his whole life creating collections not solely for Chloe, Chanel, Fendi, and the likes, but foremost for himself. He was an avid collector of antique furniture and contemporary design, books, posters, jewelry, and even people. He collected friends, models, actors. It is somewhat ironic that after his death, his possessions have become coveted collectibles, as if this object had come full circle. For that reason, I regard Karl Lagerfeld as a German collector, emphasis on German, and wonder what his collections reveal about his German cultural identity and what kind of be/longing they express. It is not surprising to learn that collecting has a long history in German culture, and which is peaked in the course of the 19th century. It is not an exaggeration to state that 19th century Germany was seized by a collecting fever. The Grimm brothers collected not only folk tales for their children and household tales, but also words for the dictionary of the German language. The King of Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm III, animated by a national patriotic impulse, commissioned architect Schinkel to build the first royal museum in Berlin, known today as the Altes Museum on the Museum Island, to house his art collection. Even the plot of 19th century German realist novel often revolved around obsessive collectors, for instance, Vor dem Sturm by Theodor Fontane, Wunigel by Wilhelm Raabe, and all this collecting mania in Germany earned the sheer contempt of philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who harshly criticized historicism in his second and timely meditation on the advantages and disadvantages of history for life. While my book will investigate some of Lagerfeld's fashion collection for Chloe, Chanel, and his eponymous label, his book collection, he owned 100,000 books and manuscripts. And his photo albums, I will focus today on the homes Karl Lagerfeld inhabited. Quote, I don't have the feeling of the notion of home or Heimat, as the Germans say. That doesn't exist for me. I'm at home wherever I go. I bring myself with me. End of quote. Said Lagerfeld in 2009 in Interview magazine. This confession may explain why he photographed so many homes. Villa Noailles, 1995, Villa Jako, a German house, 1997, The House in the Trees, 1998, Casa Malaparte, 1998. And in each album, he actually was looking to capture the once upon a time avant-garde homeliness of now deserted or abandoned houses. Or this confession, I don't have the feeling of home, may be the reason why he owned and inhabited 15 homes, mainly in France, Monaco, Italy, Germany, and the US. Even though he mostly resided in Paris on the left bank, mainly in the 6th and 7th district, Place Saint-Sulpice, Rue de l'Université, Quai Voltaire, he also owned properties in the Parisian suburbs, in Seine-et-Marne-Yvelines, on the French Riviera, Roquebrune-Cap-Martin, and on the Basque coast in Biarritz. He also possessed apartments in Monaco, in Monte Carlo, in Rome, Piazza di San Lorenzo, and Vicolo del Divino Amore, as well as in Hamburg, in the district of Blankenese. He also had an apartment in New York, in Gramercy, and a country house in Vermont on Lake Champlain. Not bad. Because each residence was the result of extensive research, collaboration with interior designers and architects, and because each home housed a precious assemblage of furniture, artworks, and books, I posit that Lagerfeld was also collecting houses. And yet I wonder, why was the German designer collecting homes to begin with? And what does that even mean to collect homes? I must also add that for each home, Lagerfeld displayed a similar pattern. He renovated, decorated, furnished each residence in a particular style, and once the project had been realized, he was slowly losing interest, growing tired, and getting rid of the house at some point. Like a child playing with a dollhouse. Clearly, Lagerfeld was more excited by the process and the prospect of a new home than by the realization of it. With the sole exception of time factor, there was for him no difference between a home and a fashion collection. Once the collection was finalized, he was moving on to the next. Looking at his homes collection, though, I wonder what type of cultural fantasy was Lagerfeld pursuing with every new home, and what kind of historical utopia did every house represent? In order to answer these questions, I offer to look at two houses. His house in Paris, located Rue de l'Université in the Hotel Pozzo di Borgo, where he lived for 30 years, and the Villa Jako in Hamburg, the only property ever owned in Germany, and where he only lived for 7 years, and lived in quotation mark. Out of the 15 residences, I single out these two in particular, since each of them represent an utopia and displays a certain longing for an idealized Germanic past. So let me start with the Hotel Pozzo di Borgo in Paris. In 1977, Karl Lagerfeld moved into his grand apartment in the Hotel Pozzo di Borgo. He would live there for 30 years before moving into a modern apartment on Quai Voltaire in 2007. The designer inhabited the left wing of the Hotel Pozzo di Borgo, an 18th century large aristocratic mansion with an imposing gate. There, Lagerfeld's collecting fever, enabled by his friend the art historian Patrick Hourcade, would know no limits. In 20 years, he would assemble one of the greatest private collections of French 18th century antique furniture, tapestries, porcelain, and old masters painting. In 2000, he would jettison this monumental collection at Christie's in Monaco and New York. The auction of the Lagerfeld collection would gross $28.5 million. I would like to pause to raise two questions. Let me show you maybe another image of the house. So I would like to pause here to raise two questions. Why was Lagerfeld obsessively collecting French 18th century art and furniture to the point of turning his home into a kitsch period room straight from the Metropolitan Museum of Art? What is the link between French 18th century and his German cultural heritage? One answer lies in Lagerfeld's biography. A childhood anecdote, which the designer repeatedly told, may give a clue. Noticing around 1945 in an art gallery in Hamburg the painting King Frederick II Round Table at Sans Souci by German realist Adolf von Menzel, a 12-year-old Lagerfeld fell madly in love with the image and requested from his parents for Christmas, so the story goes. Because the painting was expensive, despite the fact that it was a copy, the original was lost during a fire in 1945, his parents gifted him a copy of another painting by Menzel instead, Frederick the Great playing the flute, that is on display at the Alte National Gallery in Berlin. Apparently, he threw such a tantrum that his parents caved in. They convinced the gallery owner to open on Christmas Day and bought the painting for 3,000 Deutsche Mark so that young Lagerfeld could have his copy of Menzel's Round Table. Obviously, that story is too good to be true. I doubt very much that in 1945, at a time when Hamburg is literally in ruins, a German couple, how wealthy and loving they might have been, would have spent lavishly on a copy for a child. Recent biographers suspect that an older and wealthier Lagerfeld most likely acquired a copy of that painting decades later. Regardless, what matters here is the significance of that image for Lagerfeld and its major impact on him. So let's take a closer look at this historical painting of King Frederick II Round Table at Sans Souci. The Prussian king seated at the table center, I think he's in a blue petticoat, is engaged in a lively conversation with French philosopher Voltaire. That's the one who's actually leaning in on your left. So the Prussian king engaged in a lively conversation with French philosopher Voltaire, surrounded by the greatest minds of his time. I would not identify every one of them, but Scottish generals, German and French writers, scientists, philosophers, all from the Berlin Academy, that are all part of the king's inner circle. This courtly scene is a 19th century image of an idealized 18th century image, when German culture, represented here by Prussia, was open to foreign influences and in dialogue with other cultures. Upon inspection, one notices that Menzel's Round Table depicts an exclusive all-male society engaged in witty intellectual conversation, dressed in courtly costume. And now that Frederick the Great's homosexuality has been established by historians, there is no need for reading against the grain to explain why a young queer Lagerfeld was so infatuated with the painting of powerful men in ruffles and powdered wigs, which he might have read as an image of queer masculinity. Reminiscing about Menzel's painting years later, Lagerfeld explained, quote, "I decided that this elegant and refined scene represented the life that was worth living, a sort of ideal that I've since striven to achieve." End of quote. Menzel's painting was for Lagerfeld both an object of desire and identification, as well as an object of fantasy, enabling the young designer to escape the grimness and austerity of post-war Germany. By feverishly collecting 18th century decorative arts and recreating the ambiance of Menzel's Round Table in his Parisian apartment, Lagerfeld brings to mind another lover and collector of 18th century decorative arts, namely the French Jewish banker Maurice de Camondo. His Parisian mansion, filled with 18th century paintings, tapestries, furniture, sculptures, and porcelain, is now a historic museum, the Nissim de Camondo Museum, located in the 8th district in Paris. In late 19th century France, collecting Ancien Régime art and artifacts was, for Jewish aristocrats like Maurice de Camondo, a way of demonstrating a great appreciation of French culture and ultimate assimilation into it. After all, his taste proved that he had become more French than the French. The comparison between Camondo and Lagerfeld is crucial, as I believe that a similar ambition animated Lagerfeld when he started his collection of 18th century decorative arts. As a German immigrant living in France, the designer was eager to show that he was more French than the French, and even more French than Coco Chanel. If you compare the photos of their interiors, where both designers nonchalantly pose, it is clear that Lagerfeld's collection was the real deal, and that the new Chanel creative director was actually the Kaiser of Versailles. The comparison between Camondo and Lagerfeld reveals another aspect of the 18th century fever that seized both men. It is indubitable that Camondo's collection was also a tribute to the Enlightenment ideals that led to liberty and prosperity for Jewish families after the revolutionary Jewish emancipation of 1791. As for Lagerfeld, it is surprising to find among the most valuable item of his collection auctioned at Christie's in 2000, 4 Gobelin tapestries, which the French government immediately purchased using the right of preemption, which infuriated Karl Lagerfeld back then. These 4 tapestries tell the story of Esther, a young Jewish woman living in the Persian diaspora, who finds favor with the king, becomes queen, and risks her life to save the Jewish people from a pogrom, according to the Book of Esther. I find quite telling that a German born in 1933, whose father had collaborated with the Nazis, hung in his luxurious home 4 tapestries telling a story of rescue and liberation of the Jewish people. Since Lagerfeld never talked about his parents' involvement with the Nazi regime, I wonder whether those 4 tapestries may represent a sort of Vergangenheitsbewältigung on his end, a way to deal with the guilt and the past of his family and his country. And yet, the comparison with Maurice de Camondo goes so far. Unlike Lagerfeld, Camondo found toward the end of his life solace and refuge in an idealized 18th century, which he recreated in his Parisian mansion. But for Lagerfeld, this was not even an option, as he would always refuse to succumb to nostalgia. For there was no homesickness because there was no home to return to for someone who left a home country in ruins and decided to never look back. Besides, let's not forget that Lagerfeld's idealized 18th century culture was an aesthetic, materialistic fantasy, a combination of Germanness, Frenchness, Jewishness, and queerness. Lagerfeld's 18th century fiction was as manufactured as the rare decorative arts he collected. Menzel's Round Table, in which he recognized himself, was actually a copy, with the lost original, and the story of Esther depicted in his tapestries is a legend. To put things in perspective, let's also not forget that the 18th century was a period when the transatlantic slave trade was in full swings, and when black bodies were being exchanged for exotic woods to manufacture the very decorative arts so coveted by the upper class a century later. In 1789, the French Revolution would put the slave trade on hold, marking a period of freedom and emancipation for some religious or ethnic minorities. In 2000, the designer got rid of his entire collection, which he auctioned at Christie's. Whether he fell prey to nostalgia, also a danger of succumbing to it, no one knows. Truth to be told, he needed money urgently to pay the 30.5 million taxes he owed to the French government. Let me move to his second home, the Villa Jako. Against all odds, Lagerfeld bought in 1991 in his hometown, Hamburg, a mansion with a wooden garden sloping down to the river Elbe. His new house was located in the posh neighborhood of Blankenese, in the very same neighborhood where he lived with his parents when he was a child, as he recalled in an interview in 1996 with the W magazine. Quote, "I used to live next door in a house that burned down in a fire, and I've had nostalgia for that part of Hamburg with the river, the boats, and that poetic atmosphere. The first sounds I remember were the horns of the ships on the river, and my first memory in life was sheer tulle curtains and a window blowing in the wind." End of quote. After 40 years living in France, Lagerfeld's return to Germany was quite surprising, coming from someone who had claimed to have left his home country for good and had sworn to never look back. What prompted this sudden change of heart? Some of the answers to my questions may be found in the house itself. What caught the designer's eye were both its architectural style and its rareness. Lagerfeld remarked that, quote, there was not one private house like this left in Germany, and rightfully so, because most of them were destroyed during World War II, and because, quote, the people who build houses with this kind of mood don't exist anymore. And again, he was right, because the villa is now registered on Germany's National Heritage List. The house was originally built in 1922 in a neoclassical style with columns at both entrances, as you can see, and statues adorning the roof, which you can also see on the picture. This neoclassical style was en vogue in Germany in the 20s, and the house was modeled after the Munich villa of secessionist painter Franz von Stuck that represented the German revival of Greco-Roman architecture. Lagerfeld spent 7 years renovating the villa, which he furnished this time not in 18th century style, but in the 20s original style of the house. He felt strongly that the villa's interior design should stick to its time of construction and not be limited to Germany, but to Northern Europe, since in his eyes, quote, it is the same spirit, end of quote. The Hamburg villa was a sentimental exercise in style that paid tribute to the Weimar Republic. Lagerfeld made no secret that Weimar Germany was by far his favorite period, and he often cited two leading figures as his role models, the politician Walter Rathenau and the art collector Harry Graf Kessler, who both for him represented, quote, a Germany at its best, a Germany now gone forever, end of quote. And I just want to pause because you can also see that his style was inspired by these two figures, especially the color. His house, as the designer put it, quote, is an abstract house, a pure vision of the mind, because this is how he imagined Rathenau and Kessler would have lived. Once again, Lagerfeld indulged in another aesthetic and materialistic fantasy, revolving this time around Weimar culture. It was not a coincidence that he turned to Weimar Germany, a time period characterized by social and political progress, artistic development, and cosmopolitanism. My idea of Germany, quote, does not necessarily match up with the reality, end of quote. By providing an insight into his taste for architecture and interior design, his German house lays bare his longing for an idealized German past untarnished by National Socialism. Only then does one realize that furnishing and decorating houses might have been for Lagerfeld a way to work through his German past. As is often the case with Lagerfeld, there is more than meets the eyes. The name of Lagerfeld's house may provide another answer to the question of why he bought property in Hamburg in the first place. Lagerfeld renamed the Roman villa to Villa Jako after Jacques de Bacher, whose nickname was Jako, who died of AIDS in 1989. And Jacques de Bacher was actually Lagerfeld's partner of 18 years. Even though Lagerfeld had mixed feelings about returning to Hamburg, he bought the villa nevertheless in remembrance of his late partner, who was very fond of Hamburg. In many regards, the Villa Jako was a sumptuous shrine to de Bacher, and Lagerfeld's biographer Middleton recalls that, quote, many of his close friends felt that Villa Jako was, of all his houses, the most beautiful. One feels real nostalgia and melancholia when looking at the photos of the Villa Jako book. One feels real nostalgia and melancholia when looking at the photos of the Villa Jako Lagerfeld took and published in 1997 in an album entitled A German House, whose images you can see here. A sense of loneliness and stillness emanates from the black and white photos, depicting a richly decorated house that nevertheless looks empty and deserted. Wrapped in a veil of mourning, Villa Jako looks like a mausoleum in which the ghost of the past hovers. However, it is a past both lived and imaginary, which Lagerfeld conjured up by buying and renaming his house in memory of his late lover, and by renovating and furnishing it in the 1920s style. Villa Jako is actually a monument of nostalgia, built to mourn the tragic death of Jacques de Bacher and the loss of an idealized Germany. No wonder he decided to get rid of the house as someone who vehemently rejected nostalgia and refused to live in the past. Villa Jako was supposed to be Lagerfeld's German homecoming, but instead it was his farewell to Germany. A photograph taken by Jean-Marie Perrier in 1995 during his stay at Villa Jako already captured the designer's somber mood and his desire to part way with his house that hit too close to home. He even claimed that he heard the voices of his parents in the house. The image represents an austere Lagerfeld dressed in black and standing under a black umbrella in a white snowy landscape, and that's the back of the Villa Jako. Looking at the viewer with his dark shades, the designer turns his back on his German villa and on his chauffeur, made to look like a dark ghost, two emblems of a past from which the designer had already moved on. Villa Jako was a failed utopia, as the designer confessed in an interview in 1996, quote, when I finished the house, I realized this Germany doesn't exist any longer, couldn't exist any longer. But for me, it would have been the only Germany I could have lived in. It's divine to have had the idea, but I don't want to live there. End of quote. I am now coming to my conclusion. Even though Villa Jako was a mistake, it still had a great significance for the designer who held on to the memory of this failed utopia. In addition to the photo album, A German House, he also kept an olfactive trace of it. He launched a men's fragrance named Jako in memory of his lover and his Hamburg villa, where he shot the advertising campaign. So whether you recognize this is one of the columns of the house, in front of which the model is standing. It is the somewhat enigmatic slogan of Lagerfeld's fragrance that retains my attention, though. Here, always, somewhere else. So that reads as a love declaration to a deceased partner, you are here with me always. But it can also be read as the motto of a man who was always in several spatial and temporal dimensions at the same time, as if he had been granted the gift of ubiquity. I argue that Lagerfeld, by renovating, decorating, and furnishing 15 houses, spent his life looking for a home. To put it differently, Lagerfeld was constantly searching for a place of belonging and longing to recreate a German utopia. Asked in Interview magazine where he felt at home, Lagerfeld replied, "Wherever I am now, here." Thank you.